The moment Marcus pointed his finger at my face and told me to get out, he had no idea he was pointing at the woman holding the entire wedding together. Not just emotionally, financially. Every candle on those tables. Every case of wine cooling backstage. The string quartet tuning up in the corner. The deposit on this ballroom that cost more than most people's cars. All of it existed because of one person, me. And now he wanted me to leave. Fine. My name is Celeste Hargrove. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I have quietly, methodically, and foolishly funded the comfort of people who despised me. I'm a forensic financial consultant, someone companies hire when money goes missing, and they need to know exactly where it went. I trace paper trails for a living. I unravel lies buried in spreadsheets. I am very, very good at finding the truth. The irony is that I spent years ignoring the truth about my own family. But this story doesn't start with me. It starts with the way my sister looked at Marcus across a restaurant 18 months ago, like he was the answer to a question she'd been asking her whole life. And it ends with Marcus standing on the sidewalk in a rented tuxedo, screaming into the cold air at a car he couldn't open, at a woman who had already decided she was done. Let me take you back to how it all began. My family, the Hargroves, had the appearance of stability without the substance of it. My father, Gerald, was a man who loved the idea of success far more than the work required to achieve it. He'd had a decent career in commercial insurance, but a run of bad decisions in his 50s left them dependent on what he called private family arrangements. What he meant was me. My mother, Patricia, was sophisticated, warm to outsiders, and selectively blind to anything that inconvenienced her worldview. My younger sister, Sienna, was the one everyone loved immediately. She had the kind of effortless charisma that made you feel like the most important person in the room, right up until she needed something from you, at which point you understood that the warmth had always been instrumental. I was the other one, the older one, the one who got into a good university on scholarship, built a career from scratch, and then, because I loved my family more than I respected myself, started quietly paying for things. A mortgage shortfall here, a medical bill there, tuition when my parents claimed poverty, a car when Sienna's lease was declined. It was never spoken about directly. That was the unwritten rule. We don't say out loud. We just let Celeste handle it. When Sienna met Marcus Vane, my mother called me before she called anyone else. Not to introduce him. To ask if I thought the relationship had potential. What she actually meant was, do you think he has money? Because if he did, maybe Sienna's bills would become someone else's problem for once. Marcus was 31. He presented himself as an entrepreneur in the wellness space, branded supplements, an online coaching platform, a podcast that had 43 subscribers, most of whom appeared to be bots. He drove a leased Range Rover and wore a watch that looked expensive, but wasn't. In a different life, I might have felt sorry for him. In this one, I watched him charm my family with the quiet efficiency of a professional con artist and started keeping notes. Sienna was enchanted. My parents were relieved. I was cautious. And because being cautious made me unpopular, I kept my mouth shut and opened my wallet instead. The engagement party was at a rooftop venue downtown. I paid for it. The save the dates were custom illustrated. I paid for those. The dress, a $12,000 gown from a designer Sienna had fixated on after seeing it in a magazine, was charged to my corporate card under a category I labeled professional development. I am a forensic financial consultant. I should have known better. By the time the wedding weekend arrived, I had invested, and I used that word deliberately and with regret, approximately $80,000 in an event I was increasingly convinced was built on a foundation of fiction. But I was the maid of honor. I had sworn I would see it through. So I flew in from a 3-day conference in Edinburgh, skipped a client deposition I had to reschedule, and arrived at the Whitmore Grand Hotel at 8 in the morning on the day of the ceremony, ready to help. The ballroom was extraordinary. Ivory draping from floor to ceiling, cascading garden roses in blush and ivory, candlelight everywhere despite it being morning. The florists were finishing the altar arrangement, a suspended garden that cost $4,000 on its own. I had chosen it with Sienna 6 months ago over a long lunch she'd let me pay for. I was checking the placement of the escort cards when the doors opened. Marcus walked in with his groomsmen. They were already drinking. Not water. I could smell the bourbon from across the room. He saw me and stopped walking. What followed happened fast, the way things do when someone has been building resentment toward you for a long time and finally finds an excuse to release it. He crossed the room. He stood close enough that I had to take a step back. His eyes were flat and hostile in a way that had nothing to do with wedding nerves and everything to do with who he actually was underneath the charm he performed for everyone else. "You need to go wait outside," he said. His voice was quiet, but intended to carry. The florist looked up. His groomsmen shifted. I told him I was the maid of honor, and that I was doing my job. He said my job was to write checks and stay invisible, and that I'd been hovering around like a bad omen all week, and he didn't want my energy in this room. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about all the times I'd been told to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating. I thought about how much of my adult life I'd spent making myself easier for other people to be around. Then I looked at the escort cards in my hand. I had addressed every one of them personally. 200 people were about to sit down to a dinner I had arranged and paid for, and the groom was telling me to leave. "Are you absolutely certain about that?" I asked him. He grabbed my arm. He actually grabbed my arm, and he pointed toward the exit. "Get out," he said. "You're not welcome here. This is my day, and I want you gone." I said, "Okay." I put the escort cards down on the table. I picked at my bag. I walked toward the exit without running, without crying, without giving him the satisfaction of watching me unravel. My parents were standing near the cloakroom. They had seen everything. My father looked at the ceiling. My mother walked over, took my arm the way a nurse takes the arm of a patient being escorted somewhere they don't want to go, and whispered that Marcus was just stressed, that I had a tendency to make situations harder than they needed to be, and could I please just go wait in the hotel lobby and come back for photos. My sister was across the room with her bridesmaids. She caught my eye. She didn't come over. She didn't say anything. She turned back to her mirror. I walked through the lobby and out onto the street. For a moment, I just stood there. It was a cold morning, the kind that makes the city feel very large and very indifferent. I thought about everything I had given. I thought about the escort card sitting on that table. And then something very quiet and very permanent shifted inside me. I took my phone out of my coat pocket and called the event coordinator. Her name was Rachel, and she had been managing this wedding with extraordinary professionalism for 8 months, fielding calls from my sister at midnight, adjusting budgets, renegotiating contracts, never once complaining because I had been respectful and prompt, and she appreciated working with someone competent. I had built a good professional relationship with Rachel. I was about to test it. She answered on the second ring. I told her what had happened. I told her that the groom had physically removed me from the premises and that I was no longer attending the event in any capacity. I told her that since the financial authorization for all vendor services was tied to my accounts and my signature, I needed to discuss the implications of that immediately. There was a pause. Then Rachel said, very carefully, "Celeste, are you telling me what I think you're telling me?" I said yes. She said she needed 10 minutes to make some calls. I said she had 5. I opened my banking application. I pulled up my primary card, the one attached to the catering contract, the floristry balance, the lighting and sound production, the premium bar tab, and the hotel's final invoice. I navigated to the card controls. I looked at the little green icon that meant the card was active. I pressed freeze. The icon turned gray. I sent a single text to my lawyer, a meticulous woman named Diane who had been trying to get me to formalize certain family financial arrangements for 2 years and had been right about all of it. The text said, "Starting the process. I'll call you at noon." Then I walked around the corner to the hotel's attached cafe, ordered a black coffee, sat down at a window table, and waited. I didn't have to wait long. The first sign that things had shifted inside the ballroom came 12 minutes later when I saw a catering manager walk briskly through the lobby carrying an armful of menus in the wrong direction. He wasn't setting tables. He was collecting them. What I pieced together later from multiple sources, the event coordinator, a sympathetic florist, and a guest who couldn't stop laughing when she recounted it, was this. Rachel had given the signal at precisely 11:53. With quiet coordination that reflected 8 months of professional preparation, the venue staff began reversing every service simultaneously. The waitstaff moved through the ballroom retrieving glasses, cutlery, and the delicate little amuse-bouches that had been positioned at each place setting. The bar was closed. Not apologetically, not with explanation. The bottles were simply turned away from the guests and covered with linen. The string quartet received a message through their on-site contact and stopped mid-phrase. Not dramatically. They just stopped, put down their bows, began packing their cases. The overhead chandeliers, warm amber and flattering, the specific lighting I had specified in the production order, because I had attended the venue walkthrough and noticed the default lighting was unflattering, dimmed and cut. The emergency operational lighting took their place. Fluorescent, unsparing, the kind of light that shows everything. Marcus had taken the microphone by this point. He was mid-toast, the kind of toast a certain type of man gives at his own wedding, long on self-congratulation and short on gratitude. He tapped the microphone 3 times after it went dead. Then he tapped it again. He looked at the sound booth. The technician, who had been paid in advance through the production agreement but whose continued cooperation depended on the authorization remaining active, gave a small, apologetic shrug. The hotel's general manager, a composed man named Mr. Holt, who had been managing events at the Whitmore Grand for 18 years and had seen extraordinary things, appeared at the edge of the stage. He didn't use a microphone because there was no longer a working microphone. He spoke clearly into the silence. He explained that due to a financial authorization issue, all event services had been suspended pending resolution. He invited guests to remain calm. He noted that if alternative payment could be provided, services could be resumed immediately. He held out a payment terminal. Marcus's face went through approximately 4 different colors in 6 seconds. He produced a card. It was declined. He produced a second card. It was declined. My father, Gerald, stepped forward with the card I had added him to as a supplementary holder 3 years ago for what I described as family logistics, and he used exclusively for golf and restaurant bills. He inserted it with the confidence of a man who has never once been told no by a machine. The machine said no. My mother, Patricia, tried to call me. I watched my phone light up from across the street, where I had moved to my car, a dark blue Volvo, practical and paid for, to observe the situation with greater comfort. I let the call ring out. Then I blocked the number temporarily. Not permanently. Just for now. The guests began filing out. Some were confused. Some were furious. Several were clearly entertained. The social architecture of a 200-person wedding is surprisingly fragile. Remove the food, the music, and the flattering light, and what remains is a collection of people in formal clothing standing in a room, wondering why they came. Marcus found my car. He spotted it from the hotel entrance. It was hard to miss, being parked directly across the street, and he came toward it with the energy of someone who has run out of rational options and is now operating entirely on adrenaline and wounded pride. He pounded on the window. He shouted things I could hear only faintly through the glass, which was a mercy. I lowered the window 2 inches. He told me I had ruined his wedding. I pointed out that technically he had ruined his wedding approximately 45 minutes earlier when he grabbed my arm and told me to get out. He said he hadn't meant it like that. I said that when someone puts their hand on your arm and physically directs you toward an exit in front of witnesses, there isn't a great deal of ambiguity about what they mean. He switched tactics. He said I owed him. He said the wedding was a contract and I'd broken it. He used the word lawsuit twice in 30 seconds. He said he knew people. I reached into the passenger seat and picked up a manila envelope I'd placed there before going into the hotel that morning. I passed it through the 2-inch gap. Before you discuss legal remedies, I said, you should probably read that. Inside the envelope was a document I had prepared with Diane's guidance 3 days earlier, after I had done what I do professionally, followed a paper trail. I had found the paper trail that led from Marcus Vane's bank accounts to a series of gambling platforms, to 2 private lenders with problematic reputations, and to a total outstanding debt of approximately $94,000. I had found the trail that led from those debts directly to my sister's expected inheritance, an inheritance that, unbeknownst to Sienna, no longer existed because what my parents called an estate was actually a set of assets that belonged to Audrey Capital and had for 3 years.
Wait.
I mean to me, to Celeste, to my holding company. The point is, I had documentation. And documentation, in my experience, is the only currency that never loses value. I drove away while Marcus was still reading. I spent that afternoon at Diane's office. I made decisions that I had been delaying for years because I kept thinking that eventually people change, that eventually love would be acknowledged, that eventually the investment would pay emotional dividends. Diane had been right. People rarely change for the better under comfortable circumstances. They change when the comfort goes away. We formalized the property title transfers. We drafted the eviction notices for the lake house, where my parents had been living for 4 years under an arrangement they had agreed to and subsequently stopped thinking about because it was easier to pretend. We began the asset inventory, 18 pages of furniture, electronics, vehicles, and household goods that I had purchased over a decade of trying to buy belonging in a family that had decided I was primarily a resource. I called Rachel to thank her for her professionalism. She said, in a tone that suggested she had been wanting to say something like this for months, that it had been a privilege to work with someone who actually understood logistics. What followed over the next 48 hours was not something I orchestrated with pleasure.
I want to be clear about that.
There is a difference between righteous decision-making and cruelty, and I tried to stay on the correct side of that line. I did not do what I did because I wanted to cause pain. I did it because I had finally accepted that the pain was already there, had been there for years, and the only honest thing to do was to stop pretending otherwise. The lake house was the hardest part. My parents had lived there for a long time. They had planted things in the garden. They had Christmas traditions attached to specific rooms. I am not entirely made of stone. When my mother called from a roadside motel 2 days later, I listened to her message 3 times before I deleted it. But I remembered the plaza. I remembered the Whitmore Grand. I remembered my father looking at the ceiling. I remembered my mother's hand on my arm steering me away, like an embarrassment. I remembered my sister's eyes meeting mine and then deliberately looking away. I filed the eviction documents on Monday. Marcus's unraveling was faster and more complete than I had anticipated. The documentation in that envelope had circulated professionally and through appropriate channels, I want to be clear, to several individuals in his social and business network who had the right to know what they were potentially financing. By Tuesday morning, he had lost 2 significant connections. By Wednesday, he had apparently tried to solicit a short-term loan from a former college friend who showed my materials to a mutual contact and declined. By Thursday, he had checked out of the hotel suite, which he had assumed was covered for the week. It was not. That arrangement had also been canceled, and his location was unclear. My sister I handled differently. Sienna came to my office. She didn't call ahead. She simply arrived, disheveled and upset, clearly having not slept. My receptionist, whose name is Tom and who has worked for me for 6 years and has excellent judgment, assessed the situation and sent me a quiet text before buzzing her through. She came in with her phone out. She was, I realized quickly, live streaming. She had positioned herself so my company's name was visible on the wall behind her and was speaking to her followers about family betrayal, financial abuse, and what she described as her sister's pathological need for control. I watched her for a moment from the mezzanine. Then I asked Tom to pull up file B17 on the lobby display screen. File B17 was a video. It was from Sienna's own social media, a story she had posted to a close friends list 8 months ago. She had forgotten, as people often do, that close friends lists are not the same as private, and that some of those close friends have subsequently become less close. The video showed Sienna at an event in Miami, an event I had funded under the premise that it was a professional networking conference. In the video, she was laughing, holding a glass of something expensive, and telling the camera, with the relaxed candor of someone who believes they are among allies, that she had figured out how to manage her sister. You just have to make her feel needed, she said. Honestly, it's the easiest thing in the world. She'll pay for anything if she thinks it's an investment in the relationship. The lobby screen is large. 20 feet, roughly. The audio was clear. Sienna's live stream caught the whole thing. She turned around. She saw herself at 20 feet. She saw her own words ricocheting around the marble lobby. She watched her comment section shift in real time from sympathetic to something quite different. She ended the stream.
She looked at me.
I walked down the stairs. I stood in front of her, and I said what I had been preparing to say for 48 hours, which was nothing dramatic, nothing designed for an audience. I told her the rent on her apartment, the apartment she had described in her content as her independent creative space, was last paid by my management company and would not be renewed. I told her that the credit account she had used for her brand partnerships, the one that gave her the purchasing power she had been monetizing to her audience, was closed. I told her that I wished her well and that I genuinely hoped she would find her way to something real, but that the version of our relationship that had existed up until 2 days ago was over.
She tried to say several things.
None of them were apologies, exactly, though they gestured in that direction. They were the kinds of statements people make when they're trying to walk back a position without admitting they were wrong. Conditional expressions of regret attached to requests. I heard her out. I told her I needed her to leave the building. Tom called her a car. The legal meeting happened 3 days later. I sat at the head of the conference table at Diane's firm with a binder in front of me and a very specific intention. To be clear, not theatrical. Marcus arrived with a man he had found somewhere who called himself an attorney, but whose card suggested he primarily handled parking violations. My parents arrived looking like people who had aged approximately 10 years in 72 hours. Sienna arrived last and sat as far from Marcus as the table allowed. Marcus produced, with some ceremony, a handwritten note from my father. It was dated 2 years ago. It promised Sienna the lake house as a wedding gift. He presented it as a binding agreement. I let him finish. Then Diane slid the property deed across the table. The lake house had been in the name of Hargrove Consulting LLC, my company, for 4 years. My father had transferred it voluntarily as a condition of a debt settlement I had negotiated on his behalf. The terms were documented. The deed was recorded with the county. The handwritten note was a promise Gerald Hargrove had made about an asset he had not owned for 4 years to a man he had been trying to impress regarding a property that had never been his to give. Marcus absorbed this information slowly, the way a person absorbs news that restructures their entire understanding of a situation they thought they had controlled. The calculation that had driven his behavior for 2 years, that marrying Sienna would deliver him access to a wealthy family estate, was based on a lie my father had told to seem significant. The wealthy family didn't exist. The estate belonged to me. The daughter they had told him was irrelevant was, it turned out, the only load-bearing wall in the entire structure. He looked at my father. My father looked at the table. Marcus said some things I won't repeat in their entirety. They were angry, and they were revealing. The mask, once removed, showed exactly what had always been underneath. A person who had treated other people as instruments toward his own security and was now furious that the instruments had stopped cooperating. He said he was leaving. He said Sienna had nothing to offer him. He said he had already been in contact with someone else. Sienna sat very still for a moment after the door closed behind him. Then she turned and looked at me. Not with the entitled expectation I had spent so many years on the receiving end of.
Just looked at me.
Like she was seeing me from a very different vantage point than the one she'd occupied for most of our lives. She said, "I'm sorry, Celeste." 2 words. Quiet. No conditions attached. I told her I heard her. I told her I wasn't ready to talk more than that right now. I told her that if she wanted to work towards something different someday, I would be willing to try. But that it would have to be different, fundamentally, and that I wasn't interested in going back to what we'd had before, because what we'd had before wasn't actually a relationship. It was an arrangement I had funded and they had tolerated. She nodded. She left. My parents were next. My father said several things about family loyalty and ingratitude. I let him finish. Then I reminded him that I had documented every transfer, every bill, every loan, every gift, and that if he wanted to pursue the matter legally, Diane was right here and had a calendar with quite a lot of space in it. He stopped talking. My mother cried. I told her I hoped she would be okay, and that I was not going to pretend anymore that being related to someone obligates you to underwrite their life indefinitely. They left. Diane looked at me from across the table and said, "How do you feel?" I thought about it.
Light, I said.
Surprisingly light. She said, "Good. Let's talk about what comes next." What comes next was, as it turned out, better than anything I'd allowed myself to imagine while I was busy funding other people's comfort. 6 weeks after the Whitmore Grand, I took a trip I had been postponing for 3 years. A project I'd been consulting on remotely, a sustainable resort development on the coast of Portugal, needed an on-site visit. I had been sending reports and running numbers from behind my desk, telling myself I'd get there eventually. I booked the flight on the same morning I signed the final eviction paperwork. The property was extraordinary. Clifftop views, stone architecture integrated into the landscape, the kind of design that suggests someone had thought seriously about what it means to build something that belongs somewhere. I walked the site with a lead architect, a woman named Ines, who had been fighting for 6 months to protect certain structural choices that the investors kept trying to cut for budget reasons. She was right about all of them. I told her so, and I told her I was going to back her recommendations in the final report. She looked at me with the expression of someone who has been arguing sensibly into a wall for a long time and has just had the wall suddenly agree with them. We had dinner that evening at a small restaurant that had no menu, just whatever the kitchen had decided to make that day. We talked for 3 hours about architecture and structural integrity and the particular challenge of building things meant to last in a world that keeps optimizing for the short term. It was the best conversation I'd had in years. On the flight home, I looked out the window at the Atlantic and thought about value. Real value. The kind that doesn't require performance or impression management or strategic warmth. The kind that exists because something is genuinely good, genuinely useful, genuinely honest. I had spent a very long time trying to purchase belonging.
It doesn't work that way.
You cannot buy your way into being loved. You can only find the people who are capable of love and invest your time there instead. Everything else is a sunk cost, and the only sane thing to do with a sunk cost is stop sinking. I drove past Sienna about 2 months later. She was working at a cafe near her new apartment. She'd found a place she could afford on her own, which I was quietly, privately glad to know. She saw my car through the glass. She raised her hand. Not a wave exactly. More of an acknowledgement. "I'm here. I see you." I nodded. I drove on. I don't know what the future of that relationship looks like. I know what it cannot look like. Everything else is still to be determined. My parents and I communicate through Diane now. There is a structured arrangement in place. It is formal and documented, and entirely unlike the vague, obligation-soaked understanding that had governed the previous decade. It is, in its way, more honest than anything we had before. Marcus, I have no information about, and I intend to keep it that way. What I know is this: the total cost of my emancipation, the deposits I lost, the legal fees, the assets I chose not to pursue for the sake of a clean exit, came to somewhere around $160,000. That is a large number. It is also, in the context of what it purchased, the best return I have ever seen on an investment. It bought me a life that is actually mine. A home I own without condition. Work I do because I'm good at it and it matters. The freedom to sit in a restaurant in Portugal and talk to someone interesting for 3 hours without calculating what I owe them or what they might eventually ask for. It bought me the experience of waking up in the morning and not immediately beginning to manage someone else's version of reality. You cannot buy respect. You can only stop financing its absence. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply close the account.